And yeah, Raffaella is a lecturer in corpus linguistics at the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University, where she teaches, among other subjects, corpus design and data collection, statistics and data visualization, corpus-based grammar and vocabulary. At Lancaster University, she carried out her doctoral project on the application of corpus methods to the analysis of vocabulary in L2 English speech to inform language testing and second language acquisition. So she's definitely the to-go expert in anything to do with spoken corpora and lexical complexity measures. You can read further on this topic if you're interested in the Routledge Handbook of Corpora in English Language Teaching and Learning, where she published a chapter together with Dana Gablazova on spoken learner corpora for language teaching. As well, you can find a co-authored chapter by Raffaella on statistics and data visualization on the Routledge Handbook of Scientific Communication. Another topic on which Raffaella is currently working on and to which I would like to point you is the effect of reference corpora on lexical sophistication measures presented this year at the Corpus Linguistic Conference. And we, I think, agree that we really liked the talk. Before joining Lancaster, Raffaella trained in language teaching and testing at King's College London and Università degli Studi di Milano, and worked as an English language tutor at University College London, Università degli Studi di Milano, as well in secondary schools in Italy, focusing on English for academic purposes and special educational needs. Her interest for teaching never faded, and today she will go in to tell us about how she bridged borders between research and practice, and we're going to hear spoken learner corpora for language teaching. Before leaving the floor to Raffaella, I'm so happy that she's here, I'll just state a few housekeeping rules. That is, if you have questions during the talk, please write them in the Q&A. We will go back to them as we have the coffee with Raffaella after her plenary talk. So Raffaella, the floor is yours. I hope that you can share the screen if you want to give it a try first.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Arianna. This was a brilliant introduction, and I feel very grateful for being here, for the invitation, and for the opportunity to share my research with you. So I've now shared my slides, and I'll put them in presentation mode. Can you see them?
Yes, Raffaella, that's perfect. We see everything.
Great. So again, thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction. And it's great to see so many familiar faces and names. I can recognize friends, students, and colleagues. So this is great. Thanks so much. I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about bridging research and practice. I'm going to give you some examples, and in particular, focusing on spoken learner corpora and the use of spoken learner data for language teaching. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to give you an overview of what we can do to bridge this gap between research and practice using spoken L2 data. And in the second part, I'm going to present some of my research and giving you an example of how I'm trying to contribute to this. So I'll start immediately with a quote. So, speaking is a core means of communication, and the teaching of speaking skills continues to be at the forefront of pedagogical attention of teachers and material developers. So speaking as a key skill in language teaching. However, it remains a problematic area for learners. And this is due to high demands on linguistic, cognitive, and social skills, which are all involved when we produce and process spoken communication, which takes place in real time without the possibility to pause or edit the interaction. So we have these two challenges here, the combination of linguistic, cognitive, and social skills whenever we take part in spoken interactions and conversations, and also the characteristics of spoken language, which takes place in real time. We can't edit it, so it's not like when we write a text that we can go back and rephrase it in a way that it's clear. So our spoken production is not as tidy and clear sometimes as our written production. And I'll give you an example of what this means when we produce language. So what does it mean that speaking takes place in real time? Well, here we have an extract from the Trinity-Lancaster corpus. The Trinity-Lancaster corpus is a corpus of L2 English. It contains 4.2 million words and over 2,000 speakers. And it's the largest spoken learner corpus of English to date. It contains transcripts of interactions that take place during high-stakes exams of English between a test taker, the learner, and an examiner. And in this case, we have an extract from a conversation that took place between a learner of English whose L1 is Italian, and the proficiency level of this learner is B1. The learner says, I'm very proud to be a Napolitan. And I know all aspects of my city. So why are you so proud to be a Neapolitan? No, we're funny, sunny, and we always smile. Yeah. So here you can see how this transcript and how this conversation is characterized by back channeling and all these small items that play a very important role in conversations. It's characterized by false starts, by field pauses, and non-verbal vocal sounds, such as the laughing that takes place at the end. In addition to these examples, we have a lot more of spoken features that occur when we interact in conversations. We used unfilled pauses, truncated words. Sometimes the words that we use are unclear and we need to rephrase an utterance. Sometimes the speaking our speech overlaps with that of our interlocutor. And we produce discourse markers such as, yeah, well, to kind of provide feedback and back channel to our interlocutor and to engage with them. And we also produce unfinished sentences. So you can see here how spoken language is actually characterized by messy language, and a lot of features that are characteristics of spoken language have play a very important role in the co-construction of meaning, in the negotiation of meaning, and they have pragmatic roles as well. So here we have two examples of exercises taken from textbooks of English as a second language. And these are two course books that are quite popular. And they both include and present two dialogues. But in these two dialogues, if you look carefully, we can't find all the spoken language features that we just highlighted in the extract taken from the Trinity-Lancaster corpus, so from the transcript of a real conversation. Here you can see that all the sentences are perfectly well structured. They are not unfinished. There are no pauses, no overlaps, no interruptions. There are no fillers. So it looks like it's a written text rather than spoken language. And this is what most of the learners are exposed to through the teaching materials that are used in class. And the problem is that the use of this type of teaching materials sets an unrealistic target. So learners are exposed to unrealistic examples of language use in spoken interactions. On the other hand, if we use corpus data to produce teaching materials, we can present learners with all the features that enrich our spoken language. This is an example of a task taken from a handout which focuses on skills and strategies to express agreement and disagreement. And the extracts that you can see are taken from the Spoken BNC 2014. So a corpus that represents everyday spoken interactions among speakers of English as a first language. And this is taken from the Corpus for Schools project, which is accessible if you scan that QR code. So this handout includes all those features that we had a look at the beginning of the presentation. So all those features that are typical of spoken language and that make it authentic and that contribute to the co-construction of learning between two or more interlocutors. At the same time, we can also use L2 corpus data to produce teaching materials. And again, here I've included an extract from a handout that was produced by colleagues at Lancaster University, Gablazova and Brezina. And this is based on the Trinity Lancaster corpus. So it includes extracts from a corpus of L2 spoken English. And again, you can see all those features that are so important in our spoken interactions. So this kind of teaching materials represents a more achievable, a more attainable target for our learners, and also a more authentic example of language use. And this is why in this presentation, I'll argue, and I'll try to argue that the use of corpus data in language teaching is very important and can contribute to not just improving our learners' language skills, but also their awareness of specific pragmatic skills and interactive skills that are essential if we want our interactions and communications to be effective. However, these examples of teaching materials that include corpus data are not so frequent. As I mentioned earlier, most of the course books actually are based on, include examples of dialogues or monologues, which are not taken from corpus data, which are actually just created and tidied up to be presented to our learners. And this is problematic because when thinking about corpus-based approaches to language pedagogy, it is usually corpora representing L1 speakers of the target language that come more readily to mind, that learner corpora. So most of the materials are not based on corpus data. The materials that are based on corpus data, most of the time present data from L1 speakers. And when it comes to the actual integration of learner corpus data into language teaching, written learner corpora have so far enjoyed considerably more attention than corpora representing spoken L2 production. So we have a few resources available that present learners with data from L2 spoken corpora. Why? Well, the answer, one of the answers is that we have a limited number of spoken learner corpora that are freely available and accessible. And why is this so? Well, to produce a spoken learner corpus, we need to transcribe data. And this is one of the main tasks to develop a corpus of this kind. And transcribing data is a very complex process. It involves decision-making, both before and during the transcription, and sometimes even afterwards. And the decision-making concerns how to deal with all those spoken language features that we've listed earlier on, all the overlaps, unclear words, repetitions, and so on. How to deal with lexical, grammatical, and phonological errors or patterns that learners produce and that perhaps are linked to a specific group of L1 group of speakers or a specific group of proficiency. And decisions are also have also to do with the consistency of transcribing conventions and the comparability of corpora. So we always need, whenever we produce a spoken language learner corpus, we need to focus on the transcribing conventions, making sure that we produce them in a way that they are consistent across the corpus and that in the way that makes our corpus comparable to other ones. And on top of that, on top of all the decisions that are involved in designing a spoken corpus, and a spoken learner corpus in particular, we also have to deal with manual transcription, which is time-consuming, very expensive, and requires a lot of expertise. Why manual transcription? Well, this is just an example of an extract from the Trinity Lancaster corpus that was transcribed by an experienced manual transcriber on the left and by an automatic transcription software on the right. You can see how much is missing from the transcript on the right. And it's not just all those really important features that we listed, all those fillers and discourse markers and repetitions and pauses, but also strings of words, content words. And so we basically can't rely just on automatic transcription. And to give you an idea of the time and the effort involved in producing a corpus, if we think about the Trinity Lancaster corpus, again, we have 4.2 million words. It required over 5 years to develop it at Lancaster University. It involved more than 3,500 hours of transcription time and many more hours of quality checking, data processing. So it is a very difficult task. And here you can see a photo of our professional transcriber, one of our professional transcribers at Lancaster University, Ruth Avon, who worked on the Trinity Lancaster corpus. And you can see her magic tool, the foot pedal that she used, and she uses every day to transcribe spoken data so that she can just use her hands to type words and use her feet to play the recording, stop it, rewind it, fast forward it, slow it down, and so on. So it's a very complex task also in terms of coordination. All right. So now that we've kind of highlighted the importance of using spoken learner corpora in language teaching, let's just focus on what type of corpora, of L2 spoken corpora, exist. We've said that there are not so many, but well, perhaps we can kind of make a list and categorize them a little bit. Well, of course, we can categorize them based on the target language that they represent. So we can categorize learner corpora based on the L2 that they represent. And in this case, L2 spoken corpora mainly represent English. There are some exceptions, and here you can see on the right an example, the ITA corpus, which is the International Teaching Assistants Corpus. L2 spoken corpora also vary and can be categorized depending on the tasks that they represent. We can collect one or more tasks per speaker, such as in the Trinity Lancaster corpus. They vary depending on the data collection, and we have few longitudinal data sets, for example, such as the longitudinal database of Learner English, Longdale. They vary depending on the target register, whether we want to include monologues, dialogues, or both of them, as in the International Corpus Network of Asian Learners of English. And they vary depending on the setting, whether we want to record exchanges in class in an informal setting, or more formal conversations happening in academic context, or formal language used during high-stakes exams. And again, you have some examples of these L2 spoken corpora on the right. And we might also want to list multimodal data. And in this case, we have few examples of multimodal learner corpora. For example, the CASE corpus, the Corpus of Academic Spoken English, and the Padova Multimedia English corpus. We can also categorize spoken L2 corpora based on the target speakers that we want to represent. So thinking about proficiency, we can determine their proficiency based on the use of trained raters, or the proficiency can be defined institutionally, for example, based on academic university entry requirements, as in LINSEE, the Louvain International Database of Spoken English Interlanguage. We can categorize corpora based on the L1 that they include. They can include just one L1, such as the Corpus of Chinese Learners of Italian, or more. And also depending on the age groups that they include. We have corpora that include a specific age band or a wide age range. And so and of course, I'm sure we can identify more features that can be helpful to characterize existing L2 spoken corpora. So here I've given you a list of examples, and the list is not comprehensive, but you can see that it's not a very long list. And also all these learner corpora, all these spoken learner corpora are characterized by different features, and it's sometimes difficult to find two corpora that are comparable. So, so it is something to keep in mind for the future development of spoken learner corpora. Now, how can we integrate data from spoken learner corpora into our language teaching to produce teaching materials that are authentic and set realistic goals for our learners? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the framework that was introduced by Uta Römer. I'll briefly present it here for those of you who are not familiar with it. But usually we talk about two approaches to the use of learner corpora or corpus data into language teaching. We have indirect uses of corpus data when we use findings from learner corpus research to produce reference materials, so dictionaries, grammars, and textbooks. And here you have two examples. The first one is a course book that includes transcripts from a corpus, and the second one is the Corpus for Schools project, which I introduced earlier on based on the Trinity Lancaster corpus. The problem is that the indirect uses of spoken learner corpora are still rare, especially when we think about pragmatic skills and all those spoken language features that we listed at the very beginning. And also, language course books often focus on monodirectional speaking. And if they present dialogues, as we've seen in the examples, these dialogues are not characterized by all those features that are involved in the co-construction and negotiation of meaning. And we also have a rare combination of listening and speaking skills in existing language teaching materials that is important because that replicates what actually happens when we take part in real conversations in real life. The second approach of using corpus data in language teaching is the direct use of data. And this basically involves teachers and learners accessing the data directly, either on a handout that present concordances or extracts from transcripts, or accessing corpus tools and platforms. And in this case, we can use local corpora or publicly available corpora. Local corpora are usually corpora that represent language produced in a small context by the learners themselves. So, for example, teachers can collect language produced by their own learners, and then they can analyze that language with their learners to highlight good examples or weaknesses in their language production. Or we can use publicly available corpora, for example, Lindsay, to expose our learners to language that was collected from a larger population of language users. And perhaps we can use a subset of these publicly available corpora. For example, we could use the German subset of Lindsay to present data that is specific and relevant to, for instance, a German group of learners of English as a second language. And the problem with this direct use of corpus data in language teaching, well, possible problems, of course, are linked to the fact that learners have to deal with messy spoken language features. So all those pauses, repetitions, and so on. But if we think about it, we've already mentioned this, these are so important that the fact that learners are exposed to these features is an opportunity. And it's an opportunity not just in terms of when they're exposed to L2 data, but also when they are exposed to L1 data, because these features are used by L1 speakers as well, of course. Another possible issue is that learners have to deal with cut-off sentences, think about concordances. They have to understand vocabulary that might be unfamiliar. Sometimes they need to deal with a large amount of data if we present them with a large number of concordances. And they also need to understand the context from a short extract sometimes. And in this case, we can, of course, scaffold their learning, giving them instructions and appropriate training in terms of how to read concordance lines and how to interpret them and how to work with them. We can also work with relevant corpus data in this case, thinking about both the L1 group of our learners and their proficiency in the L2. As I mentioned earlier, we could perhaps extract a subset from a corpus that consists of language produced by learners who share the same L1 of our students, so that in this case, our students are exposed to patterns of language use and errors that are typical of that L1 group. Or we can use data from a specific L2 proficiency group, perhaps a little bit above our students' proficiency level, so that our learners are exposed to language input that is graded and suitable for them, that doesn't include too much unfamiliar vocabulary and complex structures. And the third possible issue is that learner corpus data might contain errors. But again, this might not be an issue. It might be actually an opportunity if we see errors as a source of learning. And here I'm going to quote Nesselhauf, who said that instead of being told once again that what they're doing is wrong, learners have the opportunity to get something right when they work with corpus data, learner corpus data, namely to identify and explain the mistake in question. So even if learner corpus data might present some inaccuracies or, let's say, creative uses of language, this is not a weakness at all, because we can involve learners in finding these examples and perhaps correcting or discussing whether they're suitable or not to the communicative context. So I'll now move on to the second part of the presentation. In the first part, I kind of guided you through an overview of spoken learner corpora, their characteristics, their importance for language teaching, and what kind of resources exist. And now I'm going to give you an example of the analysis of spoken learner corpora, of one spoken learner corpus actually, and the use of the findings from this analysis to inform language teaching. And the question that I'm going to focus on is, does task interactivity, which means the production of language in monologic or dialogic tasks, affect lexical complexity in L2 English speech? And this is a topic that I'm passionate about. So this is what I worked on during my PhD studies, and I'm still working on it now. And I find it very interesting. So I hope you'll find it interesting too. So I'll start with an example. And this is an extract, again, from the Trinity Lancaster corpus. At this stage, you might be familiar with this corpus, but just to remind you of the type of language represented in it. So the Trinity Lancaster corpus includes L2 spoken English produced in a context of language testing. So it's based on a high stakes language exam of English. And it consists of transcripts of conversations or monologic tasks produced by learners of English from different proficiency levels and L1 groups that take part in conversations with an examiner. In this case, we have an extract produced by a learner who speaks about video games with an examiner. And if I remember well, this learner is at C1 level. You can see that the language is quite complex. So if we look at this extract, we can focus on the vocabulary that it includes. And we can use a reference corpus. In this case, I'm going to use the Spoken BNC 2014 to measure the type of words, well, to analyze the type of words that the learner uses. Using the reference corpus, we can extract a frequency score for each word in this extract. And when we do that for the whole text, we can then measure the average frequency score of the text. In this way, we measure the lexical sophistication of the text. So the mean frequency score of a text is one of the measures of lexical sophistication. And the higher the score, the higher the mean frequency score of a text, the more frequent the vocabulary is, and therefore the less sophisticated, we could say. We can also analyze these texts looking at repetitions. And in this case, I've grayed out all the repetitions, and we can focus on the unique words instead, which are in black. And doing this, we can basically measure the lexical diversity of the text. In this way, we get a score, and the higher the score of lexical diversity, the more diverse the vocabulary is. So fewer repetitions, basically. We can also divide content words and function words and measure their ratio, their proportion. And in this way, we can look at the density of the vocabulary that learners use. So we can now kind of provide a definition of the construct of lexical complexity based on the example. So lexical complexity can be defined as the structural characteristics of a text based on the vocabulary that is contained and the vocabulary features of the text in particular. And these features, these vocabulary features, are based, of course, on linguistic rules, on the communicative context and the functional features of a communicative event, but also on the language users' stylistic choices and preferences. And in this study that I'm presenting, I'm using a construct of lexical complexity that divides it into three components: density, sophistication, and diversity. And it's worth mentioning that there are different frameworks of lexical complexity, different dimensions and subdimensions. I'm going to make it simple here and just focus on these three components. So based on the examples that we looked at earlier on, we can say that lexical density is defined as the proportion of content words. Lexical sophistication is defined as the mean frequency score of a text. And again, I'll just remind you that the higher the frequency score, the more frequent the words are in the text. And lexical diversity is the number of different words. So the higher the score, the more diverse the vocabulary is. So based on these definitions, the usual interpretation of lexical complexity scores is based on the identification of complex text as characterized by more diverse and more infrequent vocabulary. So this is the typical assumption, which actually I'm going to challenge a bit in this presentation. So the research question that we want to look at is whether task interactivity, so monologic versus dialogic tasks, affect lexical complexity in L2 English speech. So basically, do learners use different vocabulary in monologic and dialogic tasks? And to address this question, I've already said that I've used the Trinity-Lancaster corpus, and here you have a summary of the features of this corpus. You can see that it includes 3 proficiency levels and different L1 groups. But for this study, I extracted a subset of the corpus, of the Trinity-Lancaster corpus. I extracted the learners' production across only 2 tasks. The corpus includes 4 tasks, but I only extracted the language produced across 2 tasks, 1 monologic and 1 dialogic. Because I wanted to control for the variable of topic. So I wanted to analyze the language that learners produce to talk about the same topic across the monologic and the dialogic task. I also control for the learners L1. I only looked at Italian speakers of L2 English and only at the C1 proficiency group for now. And the final data set was about 58,000 tokens. The methodology that I used, of course, is based on measures of lexical complexity. So to extract lexical complexity scores, I used a tool that I developed, Lex Complexity Tool. And the tool is basically a very flexible and customizable tool that includes a wide range of lexical scores. And it's flexible and customizable because users can decide which reference corpus to use and which indices to use. And also it basically outputs a diagnostic output with details about every learner, and users of these tools can see how the language is actually analyzed. The reference corpus that I used is the Spoken BNC 2014. And this is because I wanted to use a reference corpus that could mirror the language mode represented in my target data, so spoken language. And the Spoken BNC 2014 represents L1 spoken English produced in everyday conversation, so informal language. I'm going to present results based on just two measures here. So I'm going to show you the results based on the analysis of lexical sophistication, just looking at content words, CW, so the mean frequency of all the content words in these texts, and measures of lexical diversity based on an index, which is called MTLD, the measure of textual lexical density, which is basically a more sophisticated version of TTR. You might be familiar with TTR, the type token ratio. So I used MTLD instead. And then I ran a linear mixed effects regression because, of course, I had 2 observations per speaker. So each learner was producing language across 2 tasks. So let's see the results. Starting with lexical sophistication and the mean frequency of content words, the baseline was the monologic task. So this means that the intercept in the first row represents the estimate for the monologic task. But you can see in the second row that learners produce vocabulary that is characterized by higher frequency scores in dialogic tasks because the estimate is positive, not 0.32. And this model explains 74% of the variance of lexical sophistication scores. And in particular, you can see the R-squared marginal value, 0.36. So 36% of the variance of lexical sophistication scores in this data set is explained by task interactivity. So dialogic versus monologic task. What does this mean? Well, let's visualize these results. Here you have box plots. Each dot is a speaker, and the position of the dot on the graph is based on the lexical sophistication score, so the mean frequency score of their content words. And we can immediately see that dialogic production is characterized by higher scores of lexical sophistication. And if you remember, that means more frequent content words. Why? Well, the monologic task in the Trinity-Lancaster corpus is a structured task. It's a presentation. And this means that learners might produce more technical, more specific, and more formal vocabulary. And this type of vocabulary might not be so similar to the vocabulary that is represented in the reference corpus that we used, because the Spoken BNC 2014 represents informal communication. So this is why the vocabulary, this is one of the reasons why the vocabulary used in monologic speech is scored as infrequent, more infrequent than in dialogic tasks. The dialogic task, on the other hand, is an informal task. So learners might produce more frequent vocabulary and vocabulary that is more similar to the reference corpus. And here you can see the role that the choice of the reference corpus plays when we measure lexical sophistication. And if you're curious about this, I'll then point out a reference of a study that I've recently submitted and conducted with a colleague on the curious effect of the reference corpus. That was the title. So what does this mean in terms of language teaching? Well, we might want to raise our learners' awareness of differences between monologic and dialogic production in terms of the type of words that they choose. So based on registered variation, we might want to help our learners acquire vocabulary that is, well, a wide range of vocabulary that is suitable both to informal and formal registers, pointing out that the type of vocabulary that they use might vary depending on monologic and dialogic tasks. And of course, these results are based on these specific data sets, but they are also, they can be generalized to task interactivity in general. In terms of lexical diversity, here are the results. And here we can see a negative sign in front of the estimate for the dialogic task. So this means that lexical diversity scores decrease in dialogic tasks compared to monologic tasks. And this model explains 50% of the variance of lexical diversity scores, and task interactivity in particular explains 16% of the variance in this data set. Let's look at the visualization of the data again. We can immediately see the opposite pattern. So here we have higher scores in the monologic task and lower scores in the dialogic task. So learners produce more diverse vocabulary in monologues and less diverse vocabulary, so more repetitions in dialogues. Well, a possible explanation for this has to do again with the specific features of the monologic task represented in this corpus, in the Trinity-Lancaster corpus, which is the monologic task is a presentation, a formal presentation, well, semi-formal to be precise, and learners are trying, basically they're trying to impress their examiner. So they might use near synonyms, paraphrases, and they might try to avoid repetitions. Also, the structure of a presentation is usually structured into different sections. Usually it starts with an introduction, a main body, and then a conclusion. So learners might shift their vocabulary from generic to more specific, again, varying their words and reducing the number of repetitions. In dialogic tasks, because it was just one in this study, learners might use more repetitions, more false starts and self-repairs, because of course they are involved in a co-construction of learning with their interlocutor. They might provide examples and clarifications to their interlocutors, and again, this might prompt repetitions. And repetitions might also play a role in showing interpersonal involvement and in back channeling. For example, when learners repeat their interlocutors' vocabulary to show these, to demonstrate these social skills. So in terms of language teaching, these results are important because they show the importance of raising our learners' awareness of these features, especially if you think about the interpretation of lexical complexity that I introduced at the very beginning when we looked at the construct of lexical complexity. I said that usually the assumption is that a more complex text is characterized by more diverse vocabulary. Okay, but how do we define complex, and does it mean more effective? Because in this case, it looks like a more effective interaction in dialogic task is actually characterized by more repetitions, because it's a type of interaction that takes into account our interlocutor's needs. So probably we need to shift a little bit the interpretation of lexical complexity scores, and we need to highlight these features of vocabulary to our learners. So the implications of this study are theoretical and methodological, because of course, analyzing these corpus data highlights lexical patterns that are used by L2 learners of English. They also contribute to methodological developments and innovations in terms of developing lexical complexity measures further, reflecting on the reference corpus. And here you have the reference that I mentioned before about the paper on the curious effect of the reference corpus. So what happens if we change a reference corpus? What happens to our lexical sophistication measures, for example? These findings also have implications in terms of corpus design, because we might want to design corpora that include a wider range of tasks so that we can analyze what language is produced by learners across a wide range of communicative contexts and tasks. And in terms of practical implications, well, these findings are based on language produced in a high-stakes exam of English. So we have implications for test design, marking criteria that might be informed by these results. And of course, the findings might inform examiners in their training sessions, and they're important to raise not just learners' awareness of lexical features across dialogic and monologic tasks, but also teachers' awareness of these features. And in the end, to develop materials that includes these features. So a final quote: corpora representing spoken L2 production offer an invaluable resource, both for understanding the difficulties faced by L2 users in spoken communication and for developing teaching resources that can help overcome these problems. And for example, we can extract some concordances or examples of interactions from corpora to show to demonstrate to our learners that some features such as interruptions, repetitions, and fillers are actually important and play a key role. So to conclude, spoken L2 data has a very important pedagogical value, both for direct and indirect uses in teaching. But there's a small proportion of corpus-based language teaching. And this is not due to lack of interest, but to issues in relation with access and availability of spoken learner data. And a wish list that could kind of be created from this presentation, well, perhaps we could think about developing, of course, more spoken learner corpora, also longitudinal, making existing spoken learner corpora available, accessible, also including local corpora. Diversifying the target languages that we represent in our corpora so that we can represent also languages different than other than English. Reporting the use of spoken learner corpora in teaching more. So what is the effect? And evaluating these uses in a systematic way. So evaluating the use of spoken learner data in teaching, looking not just at linguistic gains, not just at learners' linguistic gains, but also looking at learners' and teachers' attitudes and experience in using this type of data. And finally, developing user-friendly corpus tools, also for multimodal data. So this is the end of of my presentation. If you are interested in the list of references, you can scan this QR code. And well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll be more than happy to answer your questions based on this presentation, either now or in the coffee with session after this hour.